Welcome to our series on ketamine resources. I am privileged to be with my colleague Scott Shannon of Fort Collins, Colorado, and of the universe of the many parts. And Scott is a physician. You're a psychiatrist, right?
Yes.
And you've been practicing with ketamine for quite some time. And Scott is well ensconced in the world of psychedelic medicine, working on a training program, a year-long one, which is a holistic training program, if I recall right, and working in general in developing a marvelous clinic with research potential and a myriad of ways in which he is employing psychedelic psychotherapy to enhance people's lives. So Scott and I are going to enter into a bold and arousing conversation about ketamine work and all of the stuff that goes along with it. So Scott, tell us a bit about what you're up to out in Fort Collins.
Well, we've got a place called Wholeness Center. We've been around for 10 years. We're a significant provider of mental health in our region with, I think, 12,000 charts at this point. We have psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, naturopaths. We do IV nutrition, neurofeedback, biofeedback, ketamine-assisted therapy. We're a MAPS research site. And we've spun off a nonprofit arm called the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute, which provides CAP training and training in the business of psychedelic medicine, and is also involved in an end-of-life study with the Ketamine Research Foundation. So,
Yay!
But I got involved with psychedelics back in the 70s with Andy Weil, who was my advisor on my consciousness thesis at the U of A. And I've sort of been immersed in this world as it's woven together with integrative and holistic mental health for 40 plus years now. I used MDMA as a therapeutic agent in my practice in the early 80s before it was scheduled. And then when it was scheduled, I sort of ducked into things like acupuncture and nutrition and other avenues of treating people, but it feels like full circle coming back to ketamine and MDMA for me.
Where were you in the 80s? You didn't come to the S1 conferences, did you?
No,
You were
I
doing
was
this
in,
on your own, weren't you?
I was in rural Arizona in a backwater. Yeah.
Really? Which part of Arizona were you?
Rural Central Desert, Casa Grande, Coolidge, Florence. An
What were
hour
you
from
doing?
Phoenix.
Why were you in such a place?
I was paying back the state tuition
Okay.
in an underserved area.
And are you an Arizonian?
I came to Arizona when I was 12. I have a strong connection to Arizona, but ultimately it got too hot for us and we moved to Colorado to see some mountains and trees.
Arizona is spawning many climate cowards, isn't it? Right now, everyone's fleeing fires and heat. Not that we're so slouchy on fires. We're in the midst of an enormous cataclysm here in Northern California. So you went to Fort Collins and you were doing MDMA out there. Did you have connections with those of us doing it, or were you on your own?
No, my main connection in the 80s was, and I was in Arizona at the time, was Andy Weil and the community he developed around him in Tucson.
Yeah, we were close with Andy Weil. Actually, I go back to the 60s with Andy Weil. Andy Weil and I were in the public health service together.
No way.
DC in 69 to 71. And Andy was king of psychedelics. He actually got into public health service because we were in the Johnson period, and I never thought I would get in. I had visited Cuba illegally in '68, and Andy, I'll tell you a little story because it's fun. So Andy was in NIH, and he had legal options to import things. And he had a house in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. And he had a swimming pool with a sliding pond, one of those sliding ponds where you can just jump in and you slide down and you go in. And You know, we did novel good things there, like we would be in the pool and we'd inflate a beach ball with nitrous oxide, right? And 4 or 6 of us would be in the deep end holding onto our nitrous oxide ball and breathing out the stems of the nitrous oxide and, you know, slowly sinking into the waters. It is a long story about my dog who drowned twice in there, and I had to save him while stoned, but I won't bore you with that. But Andy had these things like he had a fist-sized ball of Nepalese hash. I'll never forget. I had never seen anything like it. And it was legal. And, you know, and he had it there and he had all kinds of paraphernalia. And it was just an amazing, wild time. And I suppose he was busy living down his bad boy Harvard psychedelic behavior that Don Latin has chronicled all too well. And, you know, but very fun times. And then Andy was very much a part of the Esalen psychedelic crowd that was exploring MDMA and other substances. So we both had Andy Wow.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Goes way back.
Goes all the way back. Do you still see him?
Oh yeah, he's on the board for our nonprofit. He was at our board meeting last week, so got to
Oh,
see him. He's hanging out in Cortez Island, waiting for things to get more COVID friendly in the U.S.
yes. I know Cortez well. I know he's hanging out there along with a bunch of others. Okay, great. Great Andy Wow story. Okay, so how do you get to Fort Collins?
Let's see. Well, I went and did a psychiatric residency at Columbia and then went to University of New Mexico. And we knew we wanted to stay in the West, so we looked around and I had some friends up this way. So we came up and have loved it here, been here 30 years.
Yeah, it's a lovely spot. I actually did a wood turning course at the engineering school years ago because I like turning wood. But that's cool. So tell us about a bit more about the ketamine practice you're doing.
You know, it's interesting. When we first started, I first got engaged with ketamine around reading some of Dimitri Popolos's work with pediatric population in bipolar children. And my first prescription was for a 12-year-old. And I don't know that that went very well. I wasn't really familiar with using it. And then about maybe 6 years ago, I used nasal inhaler in a couple really difficult depressed patients. And they both responded, but one was so afraid of dissociation, and I hadn't really learned how to coach him through it. And another found out that it was a scheduled drug of abuse, and he was a fundamentalist, and he decided he didn't want to do it. But I saw the response in both of them, and that really pulled me in more deeply. And so just began to use it mostly at first in infusion models. Then we went injection, then we went oral, then we went lozenges, oral solution. And now our primary focus is ketamine assisted therapy, just because we felt like the infusion model really didn't hold for people. But really what interests me the most, and actually what I am presenting at Science of Consciousness, is how ketamine itself molds and shapes consciousness and gives us different worlds, different realities to work with. And that's really what intrigues me most at this point.
Tell us a bit more about that. We share that interest in common. Tell us more about your view.
Well, my perspective right now is that gamma synchrony, which is the firing in the brain, not of axons, but of sort of this dendritic web in the brain, is maybe the primary carrier of consciousness. People call it the NCC, the neural correlate of consciousness. And if we look at what happens, there's only a few things that have been shown to enhance gamma power and gamma frequency in studies. And so one of those is meditation. Richie Davidson's work with Tibetan monks showing a dose response curve in terms of amplifying gamma power. But also ketamine. And ketamine is sort of easier in some ways than 20,000 hours of time on the mat. And it also gets our depressed patients in a place where they can free up of their sort of weighty default mode network that's weighting them down in their frontal lobes with these loops of obsession and negative rumination. And so what I see happening with ketamine is it sort of disconnects from those frontal lobes and gives people the freedom to sort of more fully wade into their consciousness without the weight of the frontal lobe pulling them and distracting them out of it. And so once we free up all that excessive activity in the frontal lobes with ketamine, their gamma power enhances and they have a more heightened experience of pure sort of open field awareness or consciousness. And at that point, the brain becomes much more neuroplastic because it's sort of stepped out of its prior modes of interacting. And you can just begin to play with ideas, concepts, perspectives, and insights. And then as the ketamine starts to wear off, they're pulled back into their frontal lobes, but with this awareness, this memory, this experience that can be transformative.
So, Scott, where do you see the concoctions, the glorious realities of ketamine being generated, if not in the frontal lobes? Are you talking about the frontal lobes as regulatory, basically, and that the dysregulation of them allows other areas of cortical synchrony to occur? How do you view that?
I think the frontal lobes have a regulatory, inhibitory effect, but when they get overactive, they become over-inhibitory, over-demanding in terms of power and distraction and attention, and it pulls people out of the moment and pulls people out of their sense of pure awareness and, in ways, the power of our consciousness. It becomes very, very diluted.
Because many of us, just to interject, many of us have been trained to think that the DMN and the amygdala, that the amygdala and hypervigilance is overwhelming the frontal lobes and the judgment functioning, the executive functioning of the frontal lobes, which gives us more amplitude rather than less amplitude. But you seem to be speaking about a kind of overreactive frontal lobe control system.
Well, I think what happens when the frontal lobes, and I see people that get stuck in their frontal lobes without really much involvement of the amygdala. These are people that are just anxious and obsessive and don't really have the fear or terror component that the amygdala contributes. One of the nice things in our practice is we get QEEGs on many to most people that come through our practice. And we can actually look at what's going on in their pattern. And I really think this is the way psychiatry needs to go. We need to study the brain. We clearly need to work with consciousness, but we also need to be brain-based. And so we can look at people's patterns and see whether they have an elevated theta-beta ratio or increased amplitude in the back, increased frequency in the beta range. We can really begin to see what is the pattern they're holding in the universe. And, if it's adaptive, that's wonderful. But if they're coming to us for change and help, then we have to understand where they're at and what we can do to help.
I've been intrigued by trying to look at the relationship between different psychedelic substances and their points or emanations of activity, their interconnections and neural nets. What have you discerned in that realm?
Well, I think I certainly have an increasing sense of which agents work best for which problems.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that we need to do as a science and as a practice of healthcare is begin to identify ways that we can either through clinical patterns, but more pointedly through brain patterns, identify who responds to what. We've begun to do some studying looking at the QEEGs of people that don't respond to ketamine. What picture do they have in their brains that makes them not respond to ketamine? Clearly, one of the easiest responses is people that have the classic depressive pattern where they have an asymmetry between the left and right frontal lobes. That's sort of the most common classic presentation of depression. It responds well to SSRIs and seems to respond well to ketamine. We see other...
Is that asymmetry something that's endogenous and native to that person, or is it a product of their depressive experience or emotional life of the moment?
I think it's something that they move into. It's a maladaptive pattern. It's not a healthy pattern. And that people, my belief is that people are predominantly born whole. They have genetic predispositions, and that if we can track back, we can understand their trajectory. And sometimes their trajectory is maladaptive, but it's useful to know what that looks like.
So in a sense, are you suggesting that you're going to be able to do QEGs or other assessment tools and be able to prescribe psychedelic molecules according to some notion of where people reside with those properties being expressed?
I think so. I think if we're going to look at who's going to respond to what, and if we look at their QEEG, the quantitative electroencephalogram pattern, that is really their fingerprint. It's their sort of fingerprint of consciousness in the world. If we look at that, we can begin to identify, well, this person looks like they have a trauma pattern and might be better with MDMA. This person looks like they have a depressive pattern or an addictive pattern. They may be better with ketamine. This person looks like they're really stuck in their life and need a big jolt to get them unstuck. And maybe psilocybin is going to do that.
And are you following that longitudinally? You give the big jolt, and then you look at them 3 weeks later, they need another jolt, and you look at them 6 months later, and they've been jolted into another QEG pattern. Have you been able to do some of that work?
We're not as far along in that as we'd like to be. We're trying to now just sort out diagnostic and treatment patterns and where that leads us. But I mean, this is something that I'm hoping the field can embrace, because it's obviously it's a heavy lift, as they say.
Aren't you worried about a little bit of a psychedelic DSM emerging from that? I mean, you could see something of a classificatory nature that would just create another kind of prescriptive model.
I think if we can get to that place, it'll be a good problem to have, because we would be brain-based and we'd no longer be lost in this subjective world. Yeah, I mean, I think there's challenges anytime we mistake the map for the terrain, and I think ultimately people that are drawn to psychedelics are more interested in working with soul and spirit than with phenotypes. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I've had something of a different experience. If we take my 18-person life anxiety with life-threatening illness study, which was a really intensive psychotherapy study over basically around 6 months with 3 MDMA sessions following the FDA guidelines, but a little more loose than the PTSD indication, a manualized treatment of MAPS. I would say that, we lost one patient, but that of the 18 people, as far as she went, while their emotional and intimacy patterns were very different, their responses to MDMA were fairly uniform over time. And I wouldn't say I could differentiate, if I looked at the end point of really the notion that you start here and you get here and it's different, that there was a certain quality of overall uniformity of response. Uniformity is the wrong word, but within a framework. And I thought that was quite remarkable, because everyone ended up kind of de-traumatized from some of the horrors of cancer, et cetera, being able to handle their lives better, imperfectly, but better, and a kind of internal reckoning with self and life's duration that was similar, and a recourse to pleasure. So while I hear the prescriptive path and I find it really interesting, I wonder over time if I've really seen it. What I've seen over all these decades, and you're with me on it, almost, you're not quite as old, uh, has been that people with all their psychedelic experiences also retain a certain sense of personality and continuity, sometimes surprises as to where people jump off the wagon and head, despite all their wisdom, into some forbidden territory that they should never go to. But, it's interesting that the persistence of character, especially unalloyed by doing other kinds of work like spiritual practice or, meditation or, a variety of embeddedness and activism. It's pretty interesting to look at uniformities as well.
Yeah, I think that temperament and character do have this sort of enduring quality. And what we're really working on is helping people fit, adapt, cope, manage, and express their full potential. In my sense, MDMA is really it's a relational tool. It's a tool for trauma, but it's not in its purest sense because it's not a psychedelic. It's not as profound an alteration of consciousness. It's not as uniquely transformative as some of the classic psychedelics because it's not an atomic bomb going off. It's more like, changing the direction of wind and force and opening up pathways of healing. So it seems to me that MDMA is more incremental, more relational, more attachment, more trauma focused. And it's that less profoundly and unpredictably transformative as the classic psychedelics and even ketamine can be sometimes.
But that's a very interesting discussion, right? Because there's a kind of judgment in that. And the judgment is, and I've been writing about just that, the judgment is what is transformation, really, and what do I see as transformative? So if I see ketamine as profoundly transformative of intimate relations between self and others, that is one of the great transformations of all kind of spiritual approaches that are not just solipsistic, that are not just to get me to have a mystical experience. And so between we don't do MEQs, mystical experience quotients for MDMA because they don't occur, as you're quite right in saying. It's not a hallucinogenic, though it's a trippy. People do trip in very long sequences kind of experience. And then you have the atomic bombs of, as you put it, of ketamine, maybe the hydrogen bomb of ketamine, and you have the ayahuasca kind of head to the jungle, you may never return, kind of experience of wonderment. And so those are, very different kind of transformations. And they're unmoorings in a way. And in a sense, the MDMA transformation to me is a mooring. It's a kind of a mooring in my capacity to return to a life of connection to myself and others better. And that to me is a profound transformative realization. And when we look at the ketamine work, we're also looking for the ketamine work to do the same, because most of the people who come to us are depressed, they're not learning, they're isolated, they're angry or irritable or just inert. And so we want that kind of emotional translation into a connective sphere that occurs with ketamine. And we try for that. And we try for both. And we think the explosion does help, not so much even as an explosion, but as a timeout. So we see ketamine more as here you are, there you are, you're in liberated, trippy space, journeying in worlds that you never knew you had in you, and then coming back. But what do you do when you get back, right? Who are you when you get back? And how do we help you to constitute in a way that you want to be, that makes sense to you? So, this has always been an interesting question. in our world, there have been the people who, who blow their minds. They say, I can't get enough. I want 1,000 micrograms of LSD. I want to be like that elephant that had 4,000 micrograms and feel what that's like. And that's the only way I'm going to get there. And then there are the slow and steady, I call them the Ralph Metzner types like myself, or the sensitive types. So if we took, 200 micrograms of LSD, we would, be in a realm, that would be pretty fantastic and alive compared to others. And everyone's got their sensitivity. So there are these interesting kinds of ways of seeing things. And you're speaking to some, I'm speaking to some. I'd love to hear your reactions to some of that.
Well, my sense is that, I think you're right, that all these agents can be transformative. And I think part of is understanding the sort of quality and the, they talk with ayahuasca, the spirit of the molecule in terms of the things that it's good at, the things that it does well, the fit that it has with the psyche and issues. And so all I'm arguing for mainly, I don't want to get into any sort of mechanistic model, but I'm arguing that we need to have some way to sort out what these different tools are useful for. And I think if we just use them all as a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. So I'm really intrigued by getting to know their different personality and how they relate to people and who is called to what experience. And I think brain patterns can help us. I think a deeper understanding of the medicines and I think once we get into a more widespread profession of psychedelic medicine, we're going to get the experience from the field that speaks. That's not just your opinion and my opinion. I think we need something broader and deeper.
And just on two opinions? Are you kidding me? It's not enough. But it's a fun question. So at the Boston Trauma Conference, which we did online this year, Bessel asked me, well, if I had all my tools in the toolbox, what would be the pattern of my use? Right? And I did a whole slide on it, and I was in my imaginative sphere, and in my toolbox, I had what I thought were my essential tools. I had ketamine, wouldn't give that up. I think it's priceless. I had MDMA, I had ayahuasca, I had psilocybin, mushrooms, and, maybe 5-MeO DMT, because, that has a certain property for me. I'm not a great 5-MeO DMT therapist. I love it for the experience of just zooming, letting go, and I see ketamine as a longer version of that, more accessible. But anyway, those are opinions. And I left out LSD because for me it's too long. I can't sit there for 10, 12 hours holding someone's hand. It's just too long. But that seemed to me a pretty coherent toolbox. So then if I had that toolbox, how would I administer it? Then you're doing a selective personal evaluation kind of profile to it, and I was in my mind doing a kind of, well, I have these tools, how do I position them? And I sort of began with a kind of assuming someone was a neophyte, a naive person. I sort of began with teaching the ketamine lozenge path as a slow path into it, and then a beginning into that, and then at week's end an MDMA session. And I have liked MDMA over the years. I mean, if it were legal again, I would do like 3 sessions once a week with MDMA for depression especially, because I think it really builds. And if you wait too long, you lose some of the effect. You need an integration period. Intermingling it with ketamine experience, not every day by any means, but like twice a week in some way, and putting the mushroom in a little later. It's like a recipe book. How do you really do it? But if we had the toolbox, and Underground has the toolbox, but we're we're looking at having the toolbox legally. So what would your thoughts be about such a thing?
So in my working with MAPS in the MDMA study, and then my prior experience with it, as well as I think just part of personal life journey that's interacted with MDMA very helpfully in terms of my marriage and making me a little bit less of an asshole along the way, you know. My sense is with what the way I would approach it would be doing a similar kind of prep work, a first session with MDMA, and then scheduling maybe MDMA, maybe a little more often than every month, like MAPS does, maybe every 2 weeks. But what I would do is I would be able to use ketamine intermittently when people got overwhelmed with their sense of trauma and despair and got suicidal. And the ketamine could bounce them up out so that they would get some respite. And so I would see it sort of this bouncy interactive dialogue between ketamine and MDMA to work with the severest of trauma. Um,
I
and so
like
that's
that. I like that. I might be a little more frequent on the MDMA, but where would you put ayahuasca in your toolbox?
the main issue I have with ayahuasca, and I would say with psilocybin in general, is that um, they appear to be even more dependent on set and setting. They appear to be even more um, less predictable. I mean, I think you just don't know where you're going. You know, the same is true with ketamine. MDMA, I think less so.
Yeah,
MDMA can be steered in some ways, but
yes.
um, ketamine a little bit, just it's shorter, it's a little more plastic, suggestible. But I think once you get into ayahuasca and psilocybin, you're you know, it becomes this kind of display of fireworks. You don't quite know what's going to happen. And it can be a relative dud, or it can be life-changing and in and of itself incomparable.
Well,
So,
yeah, yeah, but there's another argument to that, and that is the churches are able to steer people and help people over time and have frequent sessions with Yache, with Waska that, help people's lives. I always worry about dependency and how often one does that. Is one replacing one substance with another? But I think in certain setting, Waska is indeterminable in terms of what it's going to do to you. But I think ketamine is indeterminable. It's just shorter, so you're going to get out of its determinacy sooner than you are out of Waska before you're eaten by some horrible creature and spit out its ass.
and I
it,
think the ayahuasca churches, I think the ayahuasca jungle experiences, I think they have a much more, there's a traditional use pattern, and they fall back into something. And I think when we embrace it into, if and when we embrace it into our therapeutic palette, I think it's going to be just a bit more of a challenge for us to create a safe container with it.
I have to disagree based on experience. That's all. That early on with Ralph, etc. Well, we were doing Huasca in a non-indigenous environment, as one of my friends, Jack, whose last name I won't mention, and I said to him, "Well, Jack, you're from Queens like me. When you do Huasca, do you see jaguars and anacondas?" He says, "No, I'm from Queens. I see subways. So." It's like I think you're underestimating it. Actually, it's a really amazing tool that in good set and setting, particularly a group, it works really well for people.
That brings up the whole idea of
Yeah,
the power of groups. And one of the things that I'm really focused on now, in fact, next week, we're starting our first mental health professionals process group with ketamine.
right
And
on.
that's going to be what we hope is a sort of a prelude to doing just more general patient groups with ketamine as a way to make it accessible and to leverage the power of groups. And so I think that's a big frontier, not only for ketamine, but for in general for psychedelic medicine. Talking about ayahuasca, I think it's the power of groups. And how do we transform this solo, in some ways, a little bit narcissistic preoccupation with the individual, and how do we transform it
Sure.
into a group power that can be leveraged broadly and deeply?
Well, you saw our ketamine group. We've been doing ketamine groups with practitioners, even up to 30 in number. Really, really wonderfully successfully building community with it. I know you have a ranch, so my fantasy is you're getting away with this in COVID-19 time. COVID-19 time. Because you have people in separate pastures, so they're not breathing on each other. And you'll run around on a little buggy checking in with each of them so they don't get sick from each other. But you have a ranch. We're all envious of the ranch idea because here in California, we're pretty stuck and we're trying to figure out how can we resume training. And I want to wish you very well and all that. I'm so excited for you.
The
But,
ranch.
I think the group is the issue. And we were looking at how could we do groups with lozenges at home during COVID. And it just seemed to us that it was too risky, that not just because of the vomiting issue, but that we couldn't really run to help and support people who needed it in the midst of difficult experiences. And that in a group, in our experience, is always someone or likelihood of someone having a very difficult, agitated experience and affecting the group. And at remote, it was going to be really hard to do anything to support that. So that's why we haven't tried for that on Zoom.
We deeply considered that and came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But groups, I think groups are it.
I think groups are the future of psychedelic medicine. And I think, it's just because mental health is so underserved. There's so few psychiatrists, so many people have access issues. And how do we correct that? And, it's, to my mind, it's groups, experiential groups, and it's psychoeducation groups. And it's because groups also address the community vacuum, the interpersonal vacuum that so many people feel.
Well, I have a wicked proposal for you. Why don't we organize, like a weekend or even a day long discussion of psychedelic group therapy within the COVID time or whatever, how to do it, best practices, risks, composition, and the sense of our best practices in it. I think that would be something that would be worth sharing, bringing in some other people who are doing it or contemplating the same thing, and coming up with a good model.
Yeah, there are definitely people out there that have stepped into this already. So yeah, I'd love to be a part of that, and I think it's be a rich discussion.
Good, we will do that. So what else are you up to? Tell us a bit more. You're so diverse and interested in so many things.
Well, this business of psychedelic medicine project we're involved in, we got funded by the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative because they felt like this was one of the major impediments to the rollout of psychedelic medicine, is that we have therapists by the thousands who are interested in this, believe in it, want this. But most of them don't have any idea how to open up a business and make a clinic operate. And whether that's ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin. So we've taken on this project and realizing that, part of it is helping to just generate some basic fundamental business skills, how to run a budget and how to hire the correct people and what legal structure to set up in. But a lot of it is how to, and this has really prompted some deep thinking on my part, what is psychedelic culture? And how do we recognize that and validate it? How does that speak to the practitioners? How does it speak to the people that are drawn to it? And the people that are new or novice or beginners in this realms, what do they need to understand and learn? And, the more I thought about it is that psychedelic culture grew out of this consciousness experiment in the US, mostly with LSD, but also cannabis and peyote and mushrooms and other things. But that sort of broad exposure, not only did it create the music that we are so in love with, but it created the medicine. Holistic integrative medicine was really an outgrowth of that time, and psychedelic culture itself. And I think these two fields, these two arms of the same sort of roots, have much overlap. And I think they come from the same sort of facets of the psychedelic experience that have taught us. So that's really what I've been thinking about and writing about. I love to ponder these things, but realizing that as we're trying to teach people how to run a psychedelic business, they need to understand what is the psychedelic mindset, philosophy, and culture. And that's what's intriguing me right now. That's what I'm writing about right now.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Well, is there more you would like to speak to in this little thing of ours?
The one other piece that has drawn me lately is that in our last CAP training, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training that we held about a month ago, because of COVID, we did a lot of outdoor programming and allowed people to journey and experience outside. And the feedback we got was that, and this was often with people that had journeyed inside and then journeyed outside, was that the journey outside was more profound, was more powerful, was more relaxed, was, and people went on and on about it. And it made me think about, because of one of the facets of this psychedelic culture is this deep connection with nature and an ecological awareness that we're so connected and sort of driven by this web of nature that we exist in, is how do we bring that? I mean, it's like, well, it's one thing to think about bringing it into a CAP setting, but it's another thing to think about, well, how does this drive our creation of clinics and therapeutic settings? Should we have more connection with nature? Should our clinics be housed in a beautiful setting where people can at the very least have glass to connect them to nature, if not be immersed in it directly? And what's the difference between having four hard walls versus being immersed in nature? So that's another thing that I'm pondering and just exploring. But I love to have these conundrums that drive me to think more deeply about this.
It's a wonderful conundrum. It reminds me of an experience. So it's about over 2 decades ago that Ralph led in Northern California, and we did an ayahuasca session. And then as people recovered and had their wits about them and took water with them, everyone went up Mount Tam in separate directions and did a vision quest for until dark. And it was a wonderful way to digest and be with oneself and bring it back to the group in a very refreshed kind of way. So outdoors is a wonderful thing as well.
Powerful combination. Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, well, it's been wonderful to be with you. This will be posted on the Infinite Playa. Our program should come out shortly. And it's, as always, great to be with you.
I loved it, Phil. Thanks for the invite.
You're
Always a
welcome.
pleasure.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.